Good morning, and thank you for being with us this morning at Brookings. We are delighted to have you here for a hybrid event with a live audience as well as an audience tuning in from around the world for our discussion on Taiwan's economy during a period of global uncertainty. Today's event is co-hosted between the Brookings Institution and the US-Taiwan Business Council. Special thanks to Council President Rupert Hammond-Chambers and his team for helping to conceptualize and organize today's discussion. This event is an opportunity to take stock of how global shocks are affecting Taiwan's economy and how they may affect Taiwan's economic competitiveness in the future. From COVID-19 to supply chain disruptions, rising energy prices, rising food prices, inflationary pressure, shocks from Ukraine, there's a lot going on in the world today. And there's also a lot of concern about Taiwan's own security. So from analysts to investors, policymakers, how do they evaluate risk associated with Taiwan? At the same time, there's also growing awareness of Taiwan's central importance to both regional and global economy and security. This has led to increased expressions of support from leaders around the world for Taiwan. But it has also attracted a new wave of overnight experts who have parachuted in to offer their analysis and best ideas on Taiwan. So we wanted to get a group of experts together today to help right-size risk and identify opportunities relating to Taiwan. Our event will be divided into two portions. In our first panel, I will have an opportunity to moderate a discussion among three leading experts on Taiwan's economy in the shadow of cross-Strait tensions. In our second panel, Rupert will invite three representatives of leading firms to the stage for a discussion on doing business in Taiwan's globalized economy. I'm delighted to be joined on stage this morning by my friend Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President and Simon Chair in Political Economy at CSIS. In this capacity, Matt directs CSIS's economic program, which focuses on international economic policy and global governance. Prior to CSIS, Matt had a distinguished career in government, where he served at the White House several times, as well as the State Department and Treasury. He also worked in the private sector in banking and consulting. We're also very fortunate to be joined this morning by Shirley Lin, who's participating virtually from Taipei. It's good to see you, Shirley. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Shirley is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. She's also the Compton Visiting Professor in World Politics at the University of Virginia. And she also is chair of the Asia-Pacific Hub of the Commission on Reform for Resilience, which is reviewing responses to COVID-19. She has other responsibilities and titles as well. But her research and teaching focuses on cross-strait relations, international political economy, and challenges facing high-income societies in East Asia. She previously was the youngest woman partner at Goldman Sachs, where she led the firm's investment efforts in Asia, managing private equity and venture capital investments in 12 countries. We're also very fortunate to be joined this morning by Yoon, who is joining us virtually. She's a non-resident fellow at Brookings and the director of the China program at the Stimson Center. She's one of the most well-informed and widely quoted experts in media on China's foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries, among other things. She's worked and studied both in Washington and Beijing, including previously, proudly to us here at Brookings, as well as the International Crisis Group. So with those introductions out of the way, I want to dive right into our discussion. I plan first to ask our panelists to share their thoughts on the current fluidity in the international system and how it impacts Taiwan. From there, we will discuss regional issues, and then we will drill down to Taiwan-specific issues. So in other words, to go from a broader lens to a narrower focus over the course of our hour together. Yoon, I'd like to start with you, and then we'll ask Shirley and Matt to jump in behind you. What do you see as the top global challenges right now? And how do you see them impacting Taiwan's economic competitiveness?
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be on this panel with Matt and Shirley. And you yourself is one of the best informed China experts in Washington and in the United States. So thank you for the compliment. I would say that the most important challenge currently is the uncertainty associated with the international power equilibrium, which is still morphing, and we don't know to where. And what is the end state here? That with the war in Ukraine still ongoing, I think the Chinese are left quite uncertain about what will be the outcome of the war and what will be the outcome for Russia. And does Russia still qualify as a credible and more importantly, a powerful partner for China in terms of this counterbalancing of the United States and US-led international order? So without these questions being answered, I think the current world order is being uncertain, and we don't know whether we're looking at a bipolar world or we're looking at a somewhat still a multipolar world, or this bipolarity is going to accelerate and leading to the acceleration of the competition between the United States and China, which had already been well under the way. So I would say this uncertainty associated with the international system and what's going to happen to the power equilibrium is going to be the most important question, and also the most important question for the future of Taiwan security. Thank you, Ryan.
Shirley? I think we have you on mute right now.
Thanks, Ryan, and it's great to be here with two great panelists. And so it's my first program in 2022, and it's somewhat, I have a more pessimistic message, but perhaps a mixed message for Taiwan. I think the world since February 24th has been quite different, and Yoon has pointed out the geopolitical risks facing all economies. And this has, of course, raised raw material prices. On top of that, since then, we've seen increasing inflationary pressure. And third but not least, and most importantly for Taiwan, the supply chain disruption has been accelerated by China's COVID-19 lockdown in several cities. All of these are global challenges, but Taiwan is at the tip, at the most important juncture of these risks. And so it is both very global and very local, how these threats are different for Taiwan. Last year, when I was here with you, Ryan, we talked about decoupling, and this is, of course, very important as the world decouples. Taiwan sees both benefits and costs, and I look forward to our hour to discuss this.
Thank you, Shirley. Matt?
Well, thank you, Ryan. I'm really honored to be here, and I think that we have just a terrific group here, including you. So as Yoon said, I think you should be player manager here and give your own views as well. I think that the audience would benefit. But look, I'm generally an American optimist, but it's been hard to be optimistic, especially in the last couple of months. Since not just February 24th, but February 4th. Remember when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin promised, friendship without limits. I do think that there have been a lot of strains in the global system for a long time. Not all of them sort of policy led. I mean, there have been strains in globalization that I think have been around for a number of years. But I do think that, prior to February, I was sort of, my more optimistic sense was still prevailing that in the end, globalization needed to be modified, and we were going to have new patterns of production and supply chains. But broadly speaking, the logic of having a world in which, I'm an economist, so I'm looking at it through that lens, of the efficiency of global production patterns, maybe a little shortened supply chains and so forth would be overwhelming. I think you do now have to think more in terms of a world in which there are bifurcations that go a little further than we thought. I think for Taiwan, that is both a challenge and an opportunity. It's an opportunity, as others have said, because Taiwan is such a critical part of the global system economically, and particularly, obviously, in particular components of the global economy, to put a term on the notion of how critical semiconductors are to global production of pretty much everything. So Taiwan's really important, and there's an opportunity here. And although I'm not a geopolitical analyst, it feels like there's also an opportunity for Taiwan to be seen as a critical part of a group of countries that are committed to free markets, to democracy, and that are uniting against forces that aren't that. And so Taiwan's got, I think, an opportunity, but at the same time, obviously the geopolitics cuts against the notion of of a Taiwan that can feel secure and confident about its position, both in the global economy and the global politics. And again, I'm sure we're going to talk more about that, but it's a worrisome time.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate, Matt, you're starting with a note of optimism, and I do want to pick up on the possibilities that await Taiwan. But before we talk about the future, I do want to focus on the present. And one of the items of news that came in overnight was that China's economic numbers in April plummeted pretty significantly. This is a reflection and I think a reaction to the zero or dynamic zero COVID policy and the sweeping lockdowns that have locked down somewhere in the ballpark of 300 million Chinese people. How do you expect the ripple effects, Matt, of these lockdowns to hit Taiwan?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I should have mentioned it in my opening remarks because I think that may be the biggest economic development of recent times, China's slowdown. It's clear that it's happening. These latest retail sales and industrial production numbers just underscore that. And China is such an important part of the global system, global economy, just in pure size, but also obviously as a center of the supply chain story. And so disruption of China's growth and position as a supplier of much of the world's pretty much everything that you're looking at wherever you're sitting has Chinese components or parts or was assembled in China. And so if it slows down and cannot be that sort of centerpiece of the global system, it's got huge ramifications for us. I mean, no doubt internally, and again, here's where your expertise would be helpful in terms of the political economy inside China, but just globally, it means that we can expect, I think, slower growth globally. We can expect more inflation globally with the supply chain disruptions, and I think that that's going to have implications for Taiwan, just as it will for the rest of us, but even more because it's so interdependent with the mainland economically. So it's a huge source of concern, I think, just as an economic proposition, but politically as well.
Right. Shirley, you're on the ground in Taipei right now. Taiwan has moved away from a dynamic zero COVID policy and has a new Taiwan policy for dealing with COVID. I wanted to draw you in to ask both how is that working? How does it feel for you experiencing it? But also to the previous question, how do you see the ripple effects of China's economic slowdown reverberating in Taiwan?
So Ryan, it's a tough spot to be. You said there's nice news overnight. I thought you were going to say the news overnight is that Taiwan has changed its COVID policy overnight and is today now practicing 0+7, which means if you come into contact with somebody with COVID, you do not have to be quarantined and you need to test on a periodic basis. So it's really a very dynamic move, I would say, away from the way that COVID zero has been practiced in China and in Hong Kong. I think it's quite important. Economically, quite pessimistic. The forecast has already been scaled back from 4% to just over 3%. So I think the bad news is while China's experiencing this slowdown because of its public health policy, of all of its neighbors, actually Taiwan is hurt the most. So that is the bad news, and it's because, of course, as I wrote in last year's piece for Brookings, it continues to be very interdependent with China. And 2021, it was at an all-time high in terms of the interdependence. It's dropped slightly last year, but basically what hurts China also hurts Taiwan. And the fact that TSMC, Foxconn, they're able to operate somewhat in a better situation is that they practice what they call the closed loop system to avoid the workers, coming into contact with other people. But in Taiwan, the situation has been dire since I landed. I went through 14 days of quarantine. I came out into tens of thousands of people. At the height, it was 65,000 people infected per day. The good news is that those who are vaccinated The rate is, as of December last year, was already caught up with the rest of the world, even though in the first stage, Taiwan had a very good public health system and tracking pre-vaccine. And then when vaccines became available, Taiwan was behind the curve. It didn't have enough vaccines, and last year was behind. But as of this year, it was just catching its breath when, of course, Omicron hit. And right now, what it is experiencing is a challenge to public policy to really meet the new demand. And I think that today's change is very meaningful to show how it's going to be able to uphold its public health system so that it's able to take care of those who are in serious need. The vaccination rate among older people is the big problem. As you know, in Hong Kong and South Korea, the lower the vaccination rate for senior citizens, the more death. Death rate is still very, very good compared to Hong Kong and Korea and even Singapore this just last month, but things are changing quite rapidly. I would say that without public health, Taiwan is not going to be able to export and continue its dynamic economic to take advantage of the opportunity that Matt just talked about. The opportunity is there because there is trust in Taiwan's supply chain. But if Taiwan cannot be agile in terms of changing its public policy on health and the economy, and this goes to whether if you're in contact with somebody, are you able to still go to the factory or go to your office? So these things, I think, just as we speak today, are changing fast. I'm confident, actually, Taiwan is developing a Taiwan way. But whether it's able to do it quickly enough and also to weather the slowdown in China, I think that the next panel that you've invited will be an excellent discussion on that.
Right. Thank you. Yoon, we want to focus mostly on Taiwan this morning, but as our conversation thus far has indicated, what's happening in China will have an effect on Taiwan's economy. One of the questions that's often asked is how long can China stick with its zero COVID policy given the impacts that it is having? And I was wondering if you could perhaps share any perspective you have on that question. I also wanted to just tack on one additional question for your consideration. I noticed in People's Daily overnight that there was a lot of talk about the fact that the United States is now approaching 1 million deaths resulting from COVID, and it shows the callous disregard that Americans have for human life and their prioritization on other issues. Do you expect that as the stresses from the zero COVID policy in China continue to intensify, that the focus on America's own performance as it relates to COVID also will gain prominence?
Thank you, Ryan. I think that's a great question that we have been asking for almost 2 years now, that when is China going to reopen and when can we go to China again? And I'm afraid that for people in the China community, we have been repeatedly disappointed, and now the prospect for opening even in 2023 seems to be uncertain as well. And remember, earlier this year, the Chinese authority did come out to say that by early next year, we're going to gradually and incrementally open up. But now we're looking at the lockdown in Shanghai and the enhanced, increasingly strict procedure and policies in Beijing, let alone other smaller cities that have been under quarantine for a prolonged period of time since last year. I think what we're looking at is that China is having second thought. And one significant sign is over the past week, we see China basically canceling or postponing, I think 6 international and regional sports events that was originally scheduled to happen in China in 2023. So if that serves an indicator, I'm not terribly confident and optimistic. And remember, this Chinese media and the Chinese propaganda narrative that United States has turned into the inferno of COVID. People are completely lying flat without any procedures to defend against COVID anymore. I think that's also an indicator to the Chinese general population that, look, this is what happens when you open up, right? I think that's part of the psychological, I wouldn't say warfare, but at least a psychological campaign to convince the Chinese people that opening up will be a bad policy and China will have a very dark future waiting for it if that's a decision. But last but not least, I would say that this is a political call. We know that the party congress is happening this fall. I think we're all convinced that no opening up is going to happen before the 20 party congress is over. So I think these are all laying the foundation to I would say, manage the expectation about China opening up in the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt, one of the major trends in Asia right now is regional economic integration. And we've seen it with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which the Biden administration at some point in the coming days or weeks will announce. That's a lot of acronyms to deal with, so I thought maybe we could just take them one at a time. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, how is it working out and how is it impacting Taiwan?
Well, yes, that is. Thank you for spelling out all the acronyms because I've forgotten what they stand for now. Look, RCEP it only took effect on January 1st of this year as in terms of the implementation by most of the members that had signed on. Most of ASEAN, plus the big economies in the rest of Asia, and so it's a bit early to assess exactly, excuse me, what its impact has been on regional trade and investment patterns, but it will have an impact. It's as people here in Washington have been sort of dismissive of RCEP for a long time because it wasn't a deep agreement with substantial liberalization. Liberalization of even tariffs is not complete and is phased in over long periods of time. And there aren't a lot of hard rules on some of the things that we used to include in trade agreements when we used to do that kind of thing. But it is going to affect regional trade and investment patterns, if only because it has this new, more efficient sort of single rule of origin technical term in trade, but it allows companies to make decisions that are now more efficient, or they're going to choose, other things being equal, to put the next dollar of investment in this region, this broad region, which accounts for about 30% of the global economy. So it's a big economic region. And so that's going to affect Taiwan because Taiwan does have, largely free trade arrangements with most of this region in practice. I mean, it can trade quite freely and invest in much of this region. But, again, that marginal dollar is going to go into some other place rather than into Taiwan. The trade pattern of choice may go to other partners within this region if Taiwan's not part of it. And by the way, the United States is going to suffer the same thing. We're not going to be party to this agreement ever. I think this is something we have to take seriously, and there will be liberalization built probably slowly on top of this if you follow the pattern of how ASEAN Plus arrangements have worked in the past. So I think this is going to change supply chain patterns in the region in a marginal but significant way.
Interesting. And for CPTPP,
right.
So in the World Trade Organization accession process, both China and Taiwan entered it approximately the same time. Does that tell us anything about how China and Taiwan may pursue CPTPP? What's the path forward that you see for this?
Possibly, but I think neither economy is going to be joining CPTPP soon. Obviously, China has applied for CPTPP membership. I think the existing membership, particularly a few of the larger economies in the group, are going to slow walk that application for some time before they really engage in actual negotiations. So they're going to ask a lot of questions and do surveys and make sure that the country is really ready to commit to the high standards of the agreement. And that's going to take a couple of years at least. At some point, I do think that the members of the group are going to have to look at this seriously. And I think Japan will be the last holdout, probably. But Singapore, Australia, others that are sort of skeptical about Chinese membership are going to eventually, I think, say we have to look at this. And once China's in the room, even as in a negotiating term or as an observer, it's going to change the dynamics of that agreement pretty significantly. Taiwan, I think, and it's the same problem with IPEF. I think no existing country in the group of CPTPP members is going to be comfortable taking Taiwan in until China is ready to, at least have a serious chance of joining. So I think that's the problem. On the economic merits, Taiwan probably would be in the group sooner, would be in CPTPP sooner, but I think that's going to be very difficult for the other members of the group to accept. Again, Japan might make the case for that, so I think it's going to be a few years, and then probably, if it happens, yes, Taiwan and China probably end up coming in at roughly the same time. But I'm not actually predicting that's going to happen, because a lot could happen between now and then.
Right. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. First of all, what is this? The Biden administration is going to roll it out, I think, in the coming week or so.
Right.
What is it, and how do you envision Taiwan relating to it?
Well, in a way, it is a recognition, to be, again, constructive about this, it's a recognition by the Biden administration that the United States has to have a credible and durable economic strategy in this critical region, the Indo-Pacific. And it's not willing to go down the road, the Biden administration, of negotiating a formal trade agreement, whether it's TPP or something else, yet. I put yet in the sentence because I think at some point the Biden administration, it might be sooner than some people think, might revisit that question. But for now, they're made clear they're not going to negotiate a formal trade agreement. But they have to offer something. So they've offered this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with 4 pillars of work, all of which are good topics. Trade, supply chains, clean energy, and anti-corruption, all good topics for the United States to be engaging with the region on. The region actually is willing to engage on those issues. But the big question about this agreement is, well, there are really 2 big questions. One is, what's in it for me? So for the regional partners, I think they're all asking, if you're not going to give us greater market access to the United States, what are you going to give us? A little bit more money? A lot of people complained that the ASEAN summit last week, the president or the White House only announced another $150 million. Personally, I think that's a bit of a bum rap, in the sense that if you apply the money strategically, it can have a lot of power. We're not going to win the game of putting $1 trillion of money if China is going to do that in the region. If that's the competition, we're going to lose that competition. But we can be strategic about how we apply money. But anyway, the point is, if we're not going to provide money or market access, what are we actually offering in this thing? That's the big question. The other question is, who's in charge? Because you have many different parts of the U.S. government, many different agencies involved, many different issues. And so people are confused about who's in charge. I hear there may be some moves afoot to address that problem by having a senior White House coordinator whose sole job is to coordinate this. That'll help a lot.
Right. Shirley, how do you see these issues playing out? I know you've spent a lot of time. You've led investments across the region. You're sitting in Taiwan right now. Is the regional economic story, the regional integration story, prominent? Is IPEF something that people are thinking about a lot in Taipei right now? Oh, I think that we have you on mute again.
I think having some kind of regional and global role for Taiwan formally is the most important issue for Taiwan today. If you look forward, there's no doubt, where is the next TSMC for Taiwan? It is not going to be able to rely on the ICT sector forever. And it was an excellent interview, might I recommend to the audience, that you did with Morris Chang last month, I think. And basically he said, the United States basically went towards financialization. So there are no manufacturing talent. And I would say the same now. Taiwan, I've written about this, needs to diversify. All of its talent goes into hardware manufacturing. And if it goes on like this for the next few decades, when the cycle changes, of course, 5-nanometer chips will be made in Taiwan for a very long time. But the 28-nanometer chips that are made for the automobile industry will eventually go to lower cost foundries. And where will we go after that? I think that having a free trade agreement and being in a regional partnership is very important. But I'm very pessimistic on this. I think that with China's importance today, I think very few people realistically believe Taiwan is going to join any of these organizations, these framework agreements or multilateral agreements anytime soon. Therefore, I think it's very important for Taiwan to look for bilateral opportunities. Some opportunities seem to be prominent, but even with the US, it's taking far longer to move to the next step. And I think without doing so, Taiwan is not going to be able to sustain its leadership economically in terms of cultivating talent, having innovation, and having economic flexibility, so that if you look at the decoupling, what it really means is that the Taiwanese foundries and the manufacturing sites are going to have to spend more as they move to trusted sites outside of China. And will they be able to pass on that cost to the consumers, to fight inflation? All of these things are huge challenges for Taiwan in the medium and long term.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing from you and Matt is that standing still for Taiwan is in essence moving backwards, because the regional economic integration story is lowering cost of production in other competitive economies such as South Korea that compete with Taiwan, and that opportunities may exist in a bilateral context, but they will be tougher to realize in a multilateral context. So given that, where do you see opportunities for progress on a bilateral basis with Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think that's the obvious alternative for U.S. and Taiwan to consider, which is because the problem for Taiwan joining IPEF, I didn't say this explicitly, but again, all the other countries in the region are going to feel uncomfortable pulling Taiwan into that if the U.S. invites Taiwan in, because it'll be seen as an anti-China bloc. And so I think in practice, the U.S. is not going to invite Taiwan, so they need to do something else. I think we could now really seriously look at a bilateral trade agreement in a way that wasn't true in the past, and that's partly because Taiwan has made some difficult decisions about the agricultural market access questions, ractopamine, if you want to look that up. On Google, you can see the whole sordid history of that issue over many years. That may have been put on the side, and that gives a new opportunity for us to really engage between the U.S. and Taiwan to try to negotiate an agreement that I think would be doable on the merits, and would also, I think, get past muster. If you look at the 200 members of the House of Representatives signed a letter saying Taiwan should be in IPEF, and others who have written about we should do a bilateral trade agreement. So I think that time may be coming. Our friend and colleague Kurt Tong just wrote a piece that I commend to people in The Hill magazine in the last couple of days, advocating for that and saying Congress should mandate that if the administration doesn't jump on that. So.
Right. Well, there does seem to be a mismatch between the strategic focus on Taiwan and the economic malaise as it relates to our policy orientation toward Taiwan. So I certainly commend the idea of aligning both the strategic and economic concerns, because at the end of the day, economic competitiveness is the foundation upon which a security is built. Shirley, did you want to come in on this at all?
Yes. So I was going to. You can see my head moving on the screen. Yeah, I think that it's really important to note the credibility of the United States as I'm sitting in Taipei today. So Taiwan seems to be more and more important in terms of both its strategic importance after Ukraine, as well as its economic importance, since the semiconductor cycle has been in its favor for the last few years. But several things have really changed. And I think that it's really important for the United States to think, as Ryan has just said, about really putting the money where your mouth is, and sort of fortifying this relationship to strengthen its ability to reduce any risk and of any kind of conflict. I think first is that since Ukraine happened, young people want to fight and defend Taiwan more than ever, surveys have shown. But that doesn't really mean they can do so, even if they have the resolve. And this is the younger generation. But second is that U.S., since Ukraine and Afghanistan, has less credibility in Taiwan. That has also been shown in a very recent survey. So people feel less and less safe about U.S. coming to help if there is going to be conflict. And what that means is, thirdly, Taiwan is even more polarized than ever. And this is, I want to get back to the trade agreement part. I think it's very important to strengthen the relationship with real action and opening doors so that Taiwan can be part of the global economy, which it really formally has not been. And the Taiwan's being more polarized means anytime somebody talks about for example, joining last week's COVID summit, is this another political sort of ploy? What is it going to do for Taiwan realistically? And so any kind of opening, for example, that Matt talked about of pork and beef to allow Taiwanese to move closer to some kind of trade deal obviously has its detractors here in Taiwan. And I think that to make Taiwan more resilient requires both will as well as the ability, and that's economic competitiveness.
Right. Thank you. When Matt was talking about ractopamine, there were a lot of people in our audience here who were nodding in understanding. I think that as a collective group, we've learned a lot more about ractopamine than we ever thought we would. Yoon, security issues were brought up a moment ago, and I wanted to see if I could get you to help us unpack some of the stories that we've all been reading in the media. There's been a narrative about Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow. What do you see as some of the impacts of the situation in Ukraine for Taiwan's security situation?
Well, that's a great question, Ryan. So with what you just described, Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, I think as a part of the Chinese psychological campaign or psychological warfare campaign, there's actually another part, which is Afghanistan yesterday. So I think they're pretty much pointing to a dark direction where Taiwan will be abandoned, which is in line with what the Chinese desired approach to unification actually lies. But from the war in Ukraine, I think the Chinese are learning a lot of lessons. The war is not over, so the assessment is still ongoing. But I would say the first lesson the Chinese has learned, in fact, is peaceful unification should still be the preferred approach. Because having witnessed the economic, strategic, political, and internal, external costs of the war in Ukraine on Russia, the Chinese are forced to re-examine the pros and cons and cost and benefits of military invasion of Taiwan and the consequences of the war with the US and its allies. But if there is a war, I think a lot of the Chinese draw the conclusion, especially from the PLA strategists, draw the conclusion from the Russian war in Ukraine, which is, well, the priority should be strike a swift and decisive military victory in the event of a military takeover of Taiwan, and not let the war to protract. So basically have a swift and decisive military victory, even if it means massive mobilization of the Chinese forces, including strategic forces, has become a desired priority from the Chinese perspective. Basically, do not let itself get dragged into a quagmire and bleed out like Russia is today. So I think the takeaway is that overwhelming military force must be mobilized and deployed from the very beginning. And the implications on destruction, material destruction, and casualties could be significant. So these are on the strategic level. I think on the tactical level, there are also a lot of lessons the Chinese are discussing internally. For example, the need for better mobilization of troops and better mobilization of logistical supplies from the Russian experience. The Russian failure to decapitate from the very beginning, so basically leaving the Ukraine leaders to operate throughout the war, that's another lesson learned. There's also a lesson learned about the Russian failure to destroy infrastructure, including water, power, gas, communications, and transportation infrastructure. Again, when the world basically had followed the war on Twitter, because Ukrainians were posting photos of Russian equipment and Russian troop positions on social media, that does not really help the Russian campaign. I think the Chinese saw that very clearly. And last but not least, I would say on tactical level, the Chinese also observed the failure of Russia to fight a modern war based on high technology such as AI, facial recognition, drones, satellite imagery, precision strikes, including cyber warfare. So the Russian traditional military doctrine focused on territorial occupation by tanks is incredibly outdated. Two more lessons that the Chinese have learned. The first one is about external intervention, not direct military intervention, but through military and non-military means. That basically is international sanctions posed on Russia, which the Chinese in the past didn't think would amount to this significant of a factor. But now I think they're trying to grapple with the fact that the external sanctions, especially by a broad coalition of states, could induce significant loss and damages that the Chinese cannot just ignore. Last but not least, the Chinese conclusion, China needs more nuclear deterrence to prevent the US and Japan from intervening militarily in a Taiwan contingency. And I think it's particularly worth mentioning that the concept of Japan's potential military intervention in the case of Taiwan will invoke tremendous Chinese reactions. So the fact that the Chinese are building more nuclear warheads and enhances nuclear arsenals, and the number that had been circulated by Hu Xijin is 1,000 nuclear warheads. I think that's the Chinese way of building up its nuclear deterrence against potential intervention. So that's the Chinese lessons learned. I think for the Taiwanese, I think the lessons are on two aspects. The first one is to enhance security cooperation. There's absolutely the need to enhance security cooperation with the United States and its allies. And on the other hand, Taiwan also needs to strengthen its territorial defense by itself. So for the there had been some wavering or some doubts about the confidence in the U.S. determination to or the U.S. will to defend Taiwan, just looking from Ukraine. And I think Washington has taken a number of moves to reduce and mitigate that local confidence, including the delegation by the former senior national security officials to Taiwan at the beginning of March, and also the most recently revised fact sheet about US-Taiwan relations. Just from the framing and the wording, you could see that the US is trying to enhance the confidence of Taiwanese about the US commitment. And honestly, from what we are observing here in Washington, and Ryan, you know this much better than I do, I think in today's circumstance, if there is indeed a military contingency that mainland invades Taiwan, is unlikely, it's highly unlikely, it's almost unthinkable that the US will sit aside and not to intervene. But how to intervene, how the intervention will come out, whether it's direct or indirect, is whether it's US sending troops or mobilization of US allies to militarily intervene, or this is military intervention or non-military intervention. I think all those are still being deliberated. Then, secondly, on the aspect of the self-defense, I think Taiwan also has a lot of lessons that they learned from Ukraine, especially in terms of local resistance, and in terms of the asymmetrical capability. So those are all lessons that should be examined down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoon. So we've talked about COVID, we've talked about war, but I want to talk about risk as it relates to Taiwan's economy. How do we evaluate risk properly? Because as corporations, investors, and talented individuals make choices about where to deploy their capital and their talent, they must evaluate risk. So what advice, first Matt and then Shirley and Yoon, do you have for those trying to right-size risk in the Taiwan Strait right now?
Oh boy, if I really could answer that question, I'd be back working at Goldman Sachs with Shirley and making more money. But look, I mean, Taiwan is a big economy, a strong economy. It has incredible capabilities, in semiconductors and beyond, and increasingly, in other things, and new types of machinery and other capabilities. So I think Taiwan is such an important economy that you have to be considering opportunities economically if you're broadly engaged in any of those sectors or in an economy, just a large economy in the Indo-Pacific region. But obviously there are these economic risks that are out there: a slowing Chinese economy, supply chain disruptions, inflation, and so that's one thing that I think you have to bear in mind, because that's going to have a serious impact on Taiwan. And the geopolitical risks, certainly, I'm leery of kind of getting into sort of projecting sort of what's going to happen in the Taiwan Strait over the next 5 to 10 years. But smart people like you, who I occasionally talk to or read, seem to say that there's a real risk that there is going to be some sort of a disruptive political security event in that part of the world, and I think that has to be factored in. And I think that all suggests that you want to engage with Taiwan, you want to be there, but you want to hedge as well and have other options. But that's probably the best I can do without getting paid more.
Surely.
Well, Matt, on that note, I would say that I am a little bit more positive about my recommendation, and that is buy. And that's because the fact is, as Morris Chang said to Ryan in the interview, if there's war in the Taiwan Strait, we have a lot more to worry about than just chips. So I think that's right. Basically, I think the risk of Taiwan becoming involved in a conflict, as Yoon has just said, is quite low. But the bigger risk, as you see in China today, it's self-inflicted, which is basically poor governance. And so without being forced into the situation, China has become economically weakening this year. And I think that's where Taiwan is really a highlight. First of all, there's a large part of the supply chain that instead of trying to move away from Taiwan, that would just mean increased cost to American consumers and corporations. And I think if you think about sort of onshoring these manufacturing jobs, that's one thing. But for the risk in Taiwan is that it could score its own goal if it doesn't govern properly in terms of the new pandemic variant. And I think that what you see is a stable democracy with very, very robust institutions that have been quite agile in terms of public policy. And while the world has now been really hurt by rising raw material costs, Taiwan actually has managed quite well. If you look into the details of raw material sort of sources, the supply chain is really most affected by China, not by actually the other factors that are affecting all the other countries since February 24th. So I think Taiwan, in terms of being able to protect its people in promoting public health, in also promoting economic vitality, and most importantly, in the long term, it's also trying to change its energy source. I think actually that's a bigger threat, to try to achieve net zero and to move into renewable 60% from 45% coal. And 36% gas. This is a huge challenge. Taiwan has these long-term challenges that I would say to investors, if you are going to put a plant there and be long on Taiwan, you want to make sure that it can govern properly these three sort of pillars, the environment, the economy, and public health. And I think so far Taiwan has done really well. And that it needs, of course, more, it needs to be sustained. And so actually, as Ryan says, I've been volunteering my time to start a think tank. It just got formed today. It's called the Center for Asia-Pacific Resilience and Innovation. And I think resilience is the key, that under the pandemic, no one is spared. And hopefully Taiwan can come through it and actually provide the world, continues to be a strong manufacturing center for the rest of the world.
Good, thank you. Yoon?
Thank you, Ryan. I think from the political and security aspect, I think first of all, we need to define the risk of what. Is it a risk of Chinese invasion, or is it a Chinese demonstration of force in the direction of coercion? So are we talking about the real invasion of Taiwan or something else? So I think that is I would say the foremost question that we're trying to deliberate, because as a result of the war in Ukraine by Russia, I think the Chinese schedule, even if there was a plan to use force on Taiwan in the immediate future, which I don't believe there was, this plan will have already been postponed for another, I would say another 5 years at the minimum. So I think that's the most important takeaway, that when we assess the risk associated to Taiwan, I think mostly people talk about, well, the mainland is going to invade Taiwan tomorrow morning. Well, we need to look at the details and look at the indicators as for whether that is really true. Because one, I think people do if you think about it, the mobilization of troops by China is all observable through satellite. So for China to have a surprise attack on Taiwan is almost impossible. And I think for the Chinese, if they want to invade Taiwan, the weather conditions, especially the monsoon season and also the tide of the Taiwan Strait, they also have to collaborate, which means there are very limited windows for the Chinese to actually invade Taiwan. If you think about how in the Qing Dynasty, Shilang was using the tide to basically launch its attack. So there's a timing question and there is a mobilization question. The stealth factor, the secrecy is almost not possible in this case. So looking at the risk of the Chinese military use of force on Taiwan, I think there are a couple of things that we could follow in terms of the signals. Then I would say that two factors I would also watch is internal politics in China, of course, and also internal politics in Taiwan. In terms of the internal politics in China, I think contrary to people's belief that China that is internally unstable will be more prone to aggressive behaviors towards Taiwan, I actually don't believe it is true. For the Chinese leaders, if you follow the Chinese political philosophy, when China is unstable internally, they will seek stability externally because they want to avoid a situation where the leader is faced with like a two-front war, both internal and external. So in terms of Taiwan's domestic politics, Taiwan is going to have an election in 2024. Who will be the candidates for that election, I think also means a lot for the future trajectory of the cross-strait relations. Thank you, Ryan.
Well, thank you. I have many more questions, but I promised our audience I wouldn't monopolize the conversation with my own questions. I want to offer them an opportunity to ask their questions as well. I have a question that came in virtually that I will ask first, and while I do so, I will give our live audience an opportunity to prepare any questions that they have. One word that has not come up in our conversation is decoupling. Laurent Chevalier, the Taiwan representative for Total Energies, asks, how is Taiwan exposed to U.S. decoupling from China? Matt, do you want to offer a thought?
It is exposed, and decoupling, I think, is, as I said, I think until a few months ago, I would have said decoupling was going to be a pretty narrow, targeted, specific issue in certain, technology-related or financial-related interactions between the U.S. and China. I mean, I'd say maybe that space for decoupling has widened a little bit post-Ukraine, because in a way I think it's reinforced a mood in Capitol Hill about the risks of China specifically and more broadly authoritarian regimes disrupting the global order and a desire to be less interdependent with China, I think, is the mood on the Hill, and I think that suggests a little bit more action to broaden the decoupling story. And that's going to present challenges for Taiwan because of its integration with the mainland and its the U.S. being ultimately one of the big sources of demand for a lot of the things that Taiwan makes that run through China. So I think if we decouple from China, it's going to have implications, and I do think that's something Taiwan needs to worry about. I also think there's going to be some desire, back to my sort of hedging point. I think as U.S. policymakers look at our tremendous dependency in certain areas for certain things, I think Taiwan's control of 90% of the market for high-end semiconductors is definitely going to be something people are going to look at, and they're going to be looking at sort of trying to diversify supply, and I think that indirectly is part of the sort of decoupling story broadly defined. So it's something that Taiwan's, I think, got to worry about.
I'll follow on that, Matt. I think it's a very direct story, not at all indirect. And I would just say I did mention decoupling was the first thing I said. So it's very much, as I said, in the first part of decoupling, there were some opportunities. I think overall, now that it's gone on for a few years, it's clear that the costs are very, very heavy and outweigh the opportunities. But overall, the decoupling cost really is imposed on U.S. taxpayers, first and foremost. And I think that this is something quite important. Of course, it hurts Taiwan's private sector, which does not even have control of where this is going. So the semiconductor companies, for example, they all sell to China. And the fact that the United States decides whom you can sell to in China, whom you cannot, and what content. These are important, as in many other industries, which are, many other industries are squeezed because the Chinese, of course, have their counter policy. So domestic content requirement. So I think the private sector is very much squeezed here. But for Taiwan, the longer term trend, of course, while there is cost, in terms of the longer term trend, Taiwan is a trusted partner with protection of intellectual property rights. So of course, there are opportunities in the long term, but the short term pain is for everyone to bear, including the increased cost of moving away from China, which, by the way, we must remember the Taiwanese went there 30 years ago to cost down. And so moving away, of course, is cost. And the question is, who's paying for this cost?
Thank you. We have time for questions from our audience. I'd like to take 2 or 3 if we can in order. And then we will give our panelists an opportunity for final thoughts. Jason?
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Shirley, Yoon, and Matt, for the wonderful panel. Jason Shi here, former legislator from Taiwan, and now a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, looking at semiconductor and supply chain issues quite deeply. My question is regarding to self-reliancy, and the flip side of reliancy is dependence. If you look at today's Taiwan economy, as our panelists noted, that it's actually quite dependable on China. So in 2021, it was 136 billion. It's 43% of a total trade volume with China. And so I was wondering if panelists can elaborate on the details of a self-reliancy on the parts. I think you've all indicated the issues, which are quite obvious. But if you were to draw or to devise a plan for self-reliancy, what would that look like on the issues of the tech supply chain, the energy, and the trade? Thank you.
Thank you. So if you can, I will remind you of the questions, colleagues, in a moment, but I want to give Yoon and Michael a chance to offer their questions, and then we'll do one round of responses.
Thank you, Ryan, for the opportunity. Thanks to Brookings and all the panelists who are working on this panel. My name is Jun Park, and I'm a political economist currently at Princeton University. My question is basically on semiconductors and TSMC regarding decoupling and moving to other countries for fabrication. I am wondering whether the move to Germany and Japan, although they may not be state-of-the-art, were intended basically by TSMC or with some strong arming from the United States. This is very important to understand where this direction is going and to what extent it will expand beyond Germany and Japan. And additionally, I would just like to ask Matt what he thinks of South Korea's move towards CPTPP. Thanks.
Okay. Michael Fonte.
Thanks very much, Ryan, and thanks to the panelists. Great to see everybody in person here. I'm Mike Fonte. I work for the DPP here in Washington as the director of their mission. Wanted to ask Shirley if she would spin out a little bit more what she meant by the increased polarization in Taiwan, how that manifests itself, and what the impact might be.
Thank you. So I propose that we start with Shirley, then Yoon, and then Matt for the final word. You can pick up any of these questions as you like. The first question from Jason Shu was about self-reliance in technology. How would this play out? June asked about semiconductor supply chain diversification, moving production to Germany and Japan. Where is it all going? With an add-on question for Matt about Korea's CPTPP membership. And then the third question was about polarization in domestic politics in Taiwan. Shirley, over to you.
Oh, Ryan. Okay, sorry. The voice is coming, sort of getting cut off. I heard parts of it, but I heard Michael Fonte very clearly, so I'm going to address that first, and it's a domestic politics issue. I think the polarization in Taiwan is very much generationally divided. And so it is a very worrying trend. And among the older generation, there is a real fear, of course, of being abandoned by the United States, or that they are on the wrong side of China, especially those whose livelihood depend on China. And there's a large segment of that, while the rhetoric, of course, is that Taiwan stands with the United States on many issues. And this is where I think that the younger generation who are not as involved with China, also who have been raised in a very different environment, are very supportive. But whenever, for example, the Ukraine situation has, of course, really provoked a very robust debate here. But at the same time, I would say that the support for the DPP is going to continuing. And if I could touch on what Yoon said about election next year, I think that the trend is that there is the opposition to the DPP currently is not very strong. And this is, of course, also a very big issue in terms of governance, in that there are no real clear challengers, except one more thing is, of course, the leading cities in Taiwan are run by mayors of 3 different parties. So this makes the political competition very severe, very interesting to watch. But I would say the younger generations are leaning really very much to one side, and I think there's different layers of the older generation being divided. On the other 2 questions on semiconductor, I'm going to leave time for my 2 panelists, but I would just say that everybody now in the world wants a foundry. There's no country that doesn't want its own foundry. And I think it's a myth to think that you could just invest in a foundry and move the entire cluster of upstream and downstream to, let me not pick a country, that would be terrible for me to raise an example of places that could not be, for example, Arizona. But I think that, everybody is very clear about the tremendous, from talent all the way to sort of downstream, including testing and packaging. And I think China wanting to build self-reliance, not just in semiconductor, but in other industries will, of course, create a dilemma for multinational corporations, not just for Taishan.
Thank you. Yoon, and I should mention, I'm sorry, let's try to be brief and courtesy to the next panel.
Okay. Just very quickly, if we use China as an example, and it could be a terrible example, you look at China's reaction to the decoupling and China's reaction, obviously it's a perception that decoupling and the US strategic competition is creating this tremendous national security threat to China. I would say that maybe in the end, it's not an option, that Taiwan will have to strive for more self-reliance and independence on itself. That there has to be trade-off that between security and economic benefits. Sometimes you have to, well, it's not a black or white choice, not one over the other, but the percentage or the extent that you will still rely on, for example, China relying on the United States for high-tech products, that has to be curtailed. And remember, mainland China's policy towards Taiwan, especially in terms of the economic benefits that it gives to Taiwan, is predicated, is preconditioned upon the final scenario that there will be a unification. That's a part of the mainland strategy to send this much economic benefits to Taiwan in order to make unification an appealing scenario for the Taiwanese people. But Taiwanese people don't find it appealing to reunite with the Chinese Communist Party dominated China. But it also means that if we remove that precondition, I think mainland China's policy is also going to change significantly. So for Taiwan, it may not be a matter of choice in the end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just very briefly on Korea, I think the new Yoon administration will aggressively pursue membership in CPTPP and other arrangements, including IPEF. They're going to want to be part of maybe DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. I think that's going to be a mark of this new administration. They're going to want to be more involved in regional economic arrangements as well as probably political and security affairs. So I do expect that, and so Taiwan should be, because every time I talk to anybody in Taiwan, they always ask me about Korea. So I assume that that's a real issue that people should be, I think, planning for. And then on the other, I think we can defer maybe to the next panel a little bit more about the specifics of self-reliance in semiconductors. But just to say, to echo something or to foot-stomp something that Shirley said about cost, I mean, this move to decouple or deglobalize or to shift, foundries from Taiwan to other places is going to be expensive. And I think we've seen with Ukraine that the cost of trying to disengage on one or two commodities is a cost that, if you're paying $5, well, there are a lot of reasons you're paying $5 a gallon for gas, but the pain that's causing, or look at what's happening in Germany or other places, is a sign that I think we haven't fully analyzed or explained how expensive this is going to all be. And so, I think a little bit of insurance, we pay insurance on our house or our car or our life as a cost to protect ourselves against, unforeseen incidents. I think risk in the world has increased, and we're going to all have to pay a little more insurance. Fair enough. But I think some of the things that are being talked about to reallocate production and supply chains around the world, it's going to be very expensive. And I wonder if ultimately, as Shirley said, the U.S. taxpayer or consumer is how they're going to feel about that at the end of the day. And they don't know yet what's about to hit them. So I think we need to think about that as we talk about any of these issues.
Well, this has been an incredibly rich conversation. Thank you to Matt, Shirley, and Yoon for guiding us through and sharing a diversity of perspectives. We've heard a hedge call, a buy call, given the resilience and innovation of Taiwan, as well as a call to interrogate assumptions about the imminence of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So thank you very much. Please stand by as we transition to our next panel.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Rupert Hammond-Chambers. I'm president of the US-Taiwan Business Council. The council is a non-profit trade association funded by our members, and we have been in existence since 1976. It's an absolute pleasure this morning to co-host this event with the Brookings Institute and Ryan and his excellent program that he runs. That was just an outstanding hour, Ryan, with you and Matt, Shirley, and Yoon, really top-notch, as to be expected. I'd never be one to say that some of the thunder was stolen, because there's literally so much for us to talk about on this critical issue. No more so important today than in years gone by. Taiwan as an issue in America's national interest has just continued to rise. And for a relatively wee island with 24 million people on it, it is extraordinarily important at all levels of American national interest, and one that we can and should pay a great deal of attention to intellectually, but as a practical matter, to engage in practical ways where America's citizens are educated on, not just educated, but where a discussion is formulated within our country on what is and isn't important, and how we should deploy resources accordingly to ensure that our national interest is well represented. We've talked about a wee bit with Ryan on the military side of things. We touched on the econ side of things, and of course on trade. Trade for us is a deeply frustrating area, because it has been a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. I should say trade, not necessarily trade, that's soared, but trade liberalization as a mechanism for engagement has been a lagging indicator. And it's certainly not a bipartisan, and that is a criticism, by the way, not a bipartisan criticism. We have struggled under Republican and Democratic administrations to place trade liberalization and engagement with Taiwan at the forefront of our relationship. Surely there are many responsible for that, institutions, individuals, so on. That's not today's discussion, but nevertheless, it certainly has been a massively missed opportunity. Getting Taiwan as involved economically in the global economy and raising the economic stakes for as many countries as is possible vests them in peace and security in the Taiwan Strait and the ongoing viability of Taiwan as a critical trading partner for the world. As I thought that Ryan's interview with Morris was superb, and I really do want to hammer a nail that came up twice in the last session, that an attack on Taiwan isn't just a threat to the semiconductor industry, it's a global economic catastrophe. And I'm not being overly dramatic. It is. The domino effect is not isolated, and I'm not saying the war in Ukraine is isolated. I don't wish to be cavalier on that front. But I am saying that the economic stakes with Taiwan are massively more significant. And God forbid, should a conflict occur, whatever that means, in which Taiwan is cut off from the global economy, not just necessarily a D-Day style attack, that the economic domino effect would be really significant. Taiwan, of course, is a multi-billion dollar market for American companies and Taiwan companies, and on both sides of the Pacific, they represent partners for one another in servicing the global supply chain. And as we noted in the invitation that we pushed out, the supply chain is looking at pushing beyond cost and convenience as the primary drivers for engagement. That, of course, pushed us, in my opinion, we became overly reliant on a single area, mostly China, for manufacturing. And now there's a moment, although not in a minute, but over a period of time, in which we've come to realize that adjustments need to be made. Well, what does that look like? What role should the government play? What role should leading companies like MediaTek, Qualcomm, and others play in that adjustment to ensure that the equities are best represented for all the important players? Disruption in the supply chain is an enormous public policy consideration, as we have seen during COVID. It can have significant health effects for us individually, for our families, for our communities, and for our countries. It can also have an impact on a more material level, should you need a new car and some other platform or device that improves the quality of your life. And parts for that platform or device cannot be procured because there is disruption for whatever reason. So these are ongoing pressing concerns at a national level and at a practical and individual level. And one in which we're seeing in our newspapers and however we consume information on a daily basis. So that's sort of a primer. I regret that Miriam sadly is not going to be able to join us this morning. She has COVID in her house, and I think we've all probably been touched by COVID. It's in some way or form over the last several years. So we just, I think, have empathy for Miriam and hope that everything is fine for her. But that does not mean that we don't have an A team to my left. We do. We have Julie Welch with Qualcomm and Patrick Wilson with MediaTek. Julie has been at Qualcomm for close to 20 years. She's a vice president of government affairs. She has spent a good chunk of that period out in the region, both with her family, of course, and working with Qualcomm out of Hong Kong, and recently returned, or relatively recently returned, here to the States, a deeply experienced regional executive with a view around the region of Qualcomm's interests with all their primary markets in the Asia-Pacific region and those partners. Julie attended Virginia Tech and the University of Maryland. And Patrick is vice president at MediaTek. MediaTek is one of Taiwan's most important technology companies. By any standard globally, MediaTek is an important company. But when I think about the top companies in Taiwan, MediaTek is immediately on that list. It's a leader in the global semiconductor world. It is important because Taiwan has traditionally struggled to create a broader number of companies with a globally recognized brand, globally recognized IP that compete at a global level. We are seeing that now change, and MediaTek is a big part of the sharp end of that spear. Patrick was previously at the Department of Commerce with several other companies and also did a stint in the US Congress. He was also served in the National Guard for a number of years. And like my youngest daughter, he attended the University of Denver, which is excellent, a very good school. Julie, I'd love it if you could share a few comments with us to get things going, and then Patrick, and then we'll get some Q&A going.
Sure, thank you, Rupert. We'll just thank you for the opportunity to be here today and talk about this very important topic. I fully agree with you. The impact of on Taiwan is a global issue. It's given the great work Taiwan's done over the past 20 or so years to build and develop its semiconductor ecosystem. It really should be praised in many ways for how it has developed human capital and talent, welcomed foreign companies and investment, and created these incentives for R&D and innovation. And so, it has worked very hard to get where it is. But I will say that I'm happy that the panel this morning did not focus entirely on manufacturing, because I will say there is another very important piece of this discussion, and that is around the design companies like MTK and Qualcomm. Important parts of the security as well as the functionality are set in the design phase. And so we need to keep that in mind in this discussion about the need for greater geographical diversification in manufacturing. So, honestly, it's been a win-win partnership amongst the design companies and the foundries. The foundries need companies with scale to be able to drive their production. They need companies with demands at the leading edge of technology, and to be able to work together and partner to develop that expertise at the leading edge. And so this has been a great mark of success, and we, the private industry, have been working with Taiwan and other countries in East Asia pretty successfully over the past 20 years, and that's how the supply chains have evolved. There is a great amount of global interdependence, and they've evolved to maximize these efficiencies. And any large number of raw materials, components, final products traverse multiple country borders before the final product can be made. So it is definitely a globally interlinked supply chain, of which Taiwan retains a critical link. So I'll stop there.
Great. Patrick, perhaps you'd like to offer us some opening thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Rupert and Ryan. Thank you very much for convening this discussion today. I found the first hour incredibly beneficial as a public policy person, right, to hear such wise advice. One thing I was really taken by was Shirley's very positive note about Taiwan. And I think that being an American working for a Taiwanese company, investing in the U.S., the one thing I took away from that is that Taiwan is like the undisputed winner of an incredibly difficult time. The topic that you guys chose for our forum today about Taiwan and resiliency and coping with crisis, it's important, I think, to bring a little perspective to the period we're just coming out of. In the whole history of the semiconductor industry, roughly 50 or 60 years, growth in our industry, our companies, we're 25 years old this year, so we're trying to catch up with Qualcomm. But the plan is, right, we had to deal with an incredibly out of history moment over the last 3 years. The semiconductor industry basically has been a management challenge of irregular growth and expansion. Because while America sometimes was killing it and our consumer market was booming, Europe was in the doldrums and Africa was behind and Asia was in contraction. And this irregular growth was an incredible management challenge for every semiconductor company. If you think about the real challenge of being a TSMC or any manufacturer during this irregular growth period, which is so hard because the calls were so big, really huge billion-dollar decisions about where to do manufacturing. And oh, by the way, as we would say as an artillery officer, you have to hit the target in flight. Build today for a market that you hope will be there in 4 years. I mean, it's a maddening little industry that we're getting more respect now, but that management challenge is incredible. So here it is, we just lived through this period where it was not irregular, right? Think about that. Every jurisdiction in the world at the same moment in history had 100% increase in demand for connected devices of every kind. Everywhere, everyone needed to be connected. So you've got kids in school in India and Europe and America and Africa and everywhere, right? All having to be connected. They all wanted a new device. They all needed to do Wi-Fi. They all wanted a Chromebook. They all, which was great for us. We've fostered, but I think what I wanted to not lose is that through all of that, in the middle of a, terrible pandemic that lots of countries were struggling to solve, Taiwan did that, right? With 100% increase in production year over year, right? And it's a remarkable story that we shouldn't lose sight of, that they were able to do that. And to tie it back again to something that was said in the previous panel is that there is a premium in the marketplace for good governance. And that's the thing that Taiwan has demonstrated. And I would say the reason I'm bullish on Taiwan as a place to invest is that the stark contrast between creativity and good government and stability that Taiwan presents, right? The value of it just keeps going up, right? When you have better, more demonstrated examples of bad government, whether that's dysfunctional Congress here or, the problem in crisis in Ukraine or in China, as they look more problematic and risky, Taiwan being a stable, successful, democratic society, the benefit of that by comparison really goes up. And I think that's the one thing for us as we look to grow and invest. MediaTek is still continuing to grow at a really excellent clip. And part of the reason for that, right, is we are becoming a global company, right? We're less dependent on Taiwan. We're more globally focused. And I think that is the real trick that as a company, we're all trying to figure out, right, is how do we go from being a Taiwanese company operating globally, right, which is kind of the phase we have been in for a while, to being a global company that happens to be headquartered in Taiwan, right? So that's a big philosophical change for us, right, where we see, all opportunities wherever they are in the world. And while Taiwan will continue to remain a great headquarters, a great place to be invested, one of the best workforces in the world for semiconductors, we look everywhere else too, because as a global company, we need to make those calls about where to deploy capital. And for fabless companies like us, we don't get those cool big check moments, right, where you get to make a $15 billion investment in a particular geography, right, where you get to be a hero. But for us, it's just slow progress to tell our story, attract brilliant people to come and solve problems in our company. And that's where we're going to do it, right? And hopefully, for me, I tell that story to politicians here in Washington all the time that, we want to grow here. We got to make more engineers here. And that's the same story everywhere, whether it's Japan or Europe or anywhere, right? It's this race for talent. And we'll talk more about that today. But I would say I would be remiss if I didn't say when Taiwan has been so successful, it really is because they cultivated this wonderful talent that was able to put them at the very top of the market and to withstand this really historic, out of history moment for the semiconductor industry.
Mm. You've been very on message, Patrick, actually, in the time I've certainly had the privilege of knowing you on this issue. I mean, I think talent, of course, is and should remain at the forefront of all government policy in ensuring that we have the workforce necessary to meet the demands of our companies, whatever those might be, whether it's at the cutting edge of technology or, frankly, whether it's producing welders who are competent and capable of doing work along those lines. We need technical skills, and that can be broadly interpreted across the economy. About 20 years ago, an Aussie bloke wrote a book called Silicon Shield. For those of us who've dived in, some of you may have even read it. I know I have. I know my colleagues over there have. It's certainly a term now that we're seeing a wee bit more in public coverage on Taiwan. This notion that Taiwan's prowess in the semiconductor industry is so significant that it offers a shield. Because if you accept the premise that if there's a disruption in the chip space, Taiwan's dominance in high-end chip manufacturing and the domino effect that disruption would have a catastrophic economic impact, including on China, that it would deter the Chinese from attacking. There are some who are chafing on that and some who fully embrace it. I would note that while the United States, we're seeing a surge in industrial policy, the United States has allocated, I think, it's not called Chips for America Act anymore. It's moved through 2 or 3 iterations, but there's about $52 or $53 billion in there for semiconductor companies. The CAPEX commitment for TSMC over this 3-year period is $100 billion. So even the largest economy in the world, the United States, allocating money to a critical space still pales in comparison to the kind of resources that companies are bringing to bear to serve the interests of their partner companies in ensuring, to Patrick's point, that they have the capacity they need 3-4 years down the line. And that's, that's a kind of commitment and leap of faith. But back to the two of you. How did the two of you think about this notion of silicon shield? Is Taiwan's semiconductor industry a silicon shield? And how do you think, Julie, of course, in your prior, when you were living in Hong Kong and you were moving around the region on a weekly basis, is divestment even regionally a reasonable solution here? So how do you think about Silicon Shield and how do you think about where it goes?
Well, if I can start with the second question.
Sure.
I can just repeat some of the comments that were made in the earlier panel today. Yes, there is going to be some adjustment in the global supply chains. Yes, it is going to be expensive, and yes, it is going to take time. This isn't something that you can do overnight. It takes a long time to increase capacity, and it takes a lot of expertise to manufacture these wafers. And I think on the question of the silicon shield, I'm going to let Patrick go first on that one.
Well, you've got some corporate folks up here, Rupert, right? We're not commentators. That's what we have Ryan and his colleagues around to speculate on geopolitics and, what the strategy, right, of Taiwan is. But it's undeniable, right? Taiwan is essential to global consumer electronics in every way, right? It's an essential part of the global supply chain. If I were a senior leader in Taiwan, I would take great pride in that, right? That we are essential to the world's economy. And I think that goes to the point that we heard very strongly in the earlier panel, right? That every time you navigate a question about Taiwan's political future, you have to factor that in, right? The rest of the world cannot allow, right, a massive disruption. We're political people. We deal. The congressman grabbed me and asked me because the Ford factory in my hometown of Kansas City was closed for 10 days, right? And it was a huge political issue, right? Like semiconductors, Patrick, what are you going to do about that? And I'm like, well, that's not really us, sorry. We can't solve your problem. But imagine, right, roughly 6,000 consumer electronics factories just on the east coast of China depend on chips daily delivered from Taiwan, right? So that's millions of Chinese workers who go to work in factories assembling our consumer electronics that depend on the delivery of chips right, from our companies and thousands of other electronics companies around the world. That integration of the economy, that isn't likely to change. And I think the leadership in Beijing, which is very sensitive to that, they really care about their workforce. That vulnerability of those workers, that makes them have pause. And I think that's one of the messages we had. So is it a silicon shield? I think that's something that academics can deal with. Is Taiwan essential, to the global supply chain? Yes. Is Taiwan essential to China's economy? Yes, it's essential to our economy, it's essential to China's economy, and that relationship that Taiwan has built with everybody's consumer electronics industry is really to its credit. And again, it goes back to my central argument is that the success of a liberal democracy in Asia, like Taiwan, right, what they've been able to accomplish is really just so remarkable in 20 years. You think about it, when I entered the political scene, Taiwan wasn't yet a democracy, right? And to come so quickly and to show such success, it's something that I think all people should be proud of, right? And the role that they have played in this most recent crisis is just an example of that maturity, right? To be able to deal with that and the role that they play.
I'll take a quick question from the audience if somebody's got one. Yes, Jason.
Thanks, Rupert. Thanks, Judy, and good to see you, Patrick. My questions are related to, a couple of things. One is the talent. Obviously, there's going to be a huge shortage in talent in the years to come in the semiconductor industry. How do you foresee, how do you envision Taiwan and U.S. work closely in this part to cultivate talent, to ensure sustainability in talent pipeline? That's my first question. My second question is regarding to the CHIPS Act. I think Rupert has brought up, I don't know what the name it is now after the several iterations.
We all do that, so yeah, the CHIPS Act or whatever it is this week. Yes,
right. So my point is, it seems to me that CHIPS Act is very focused on manufacturing, and it focuses on giving money to manufacturing. What about design? I feel design is an integral part of the entire IC ecosystem, and MediaTek and Qualcomm play a very, very important roles in this part. If U.S. were to ensure its leading position in the global semiconductor industry, design is everything. So I wanted you to comment on this both. Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
What's the first question?
About talent, the role for the competition for talent and talent shortage and how we would cope with that. So.
Well, let me just comment on the talent piece of this. And I think there was an important mechanism that was set up between public-private, between the governments of Taiwan and the U.S. In November last year, and I might get the acronym wrong as well, TTIC. Someone else might have to help me remind me what that stands for. But it is a new platform, I think, where there can be greater dialogue on how the two countries, public and private sector, can work together and enhance their human capital development, upskilling some of the talent. So I hope that we can look at that opportunity and that platform to expand some of the cooperation, exchange, university exchange, around that. Frankly, Taiwan's done a really great job. There's very specialized programs at a lot of the universities around semiconductor engineering development. So there is some work that needs to be done, of course, always on that. It's a challenge. So why don't you take the second one? You're more your area of expertise, I think.
Obviously, the CHIPS Act is important to the whole industry, right? Fabless companies care about capacity, right? And so we look at the trend lines, right, for technology adoption globally, what 5G is doing, the proliferation of technology. That means the whole world is going to need a lot more capacity. So we didn't talk about this, but billions of dollars calls that are being made right now about where to build new capacity, whether that's in Germany or whether it's in Japan or here in Arizona or Texas or New York. that capacity is just good. It's good for us. We have to fight for it, So more sellers of foundry capacity, great for chip designers. The other half of that, though, contained in the CHIPS Act, right, is a amazing expansion of research and development in the United States at universities on basic research around semiconductors, materials, and devices. It does, for my taste, representing a fabless company, it probably focuses less than it ought to on developing the talent programs that we need for chip design, particularly analog and artificial intelligence and some other key areas of focus that we'd like to see. But that's for us, right? Companies are supposed to tug on the coats of these brilliant folks who run our engineering schools and say, hey, we see where this is going, you need to. And certainly MediaTek, I've only been on the job for 2 years, but one of the things I've really been doing is spending a lot of time with higher education, right? To talk to deans of engineering schools and to others about why we need to produce more design engineers here in the US. And I would be remiss, by the way, Rupert, if I didn't talk about this massive integration. I mean, the workforce in Taiwan, I think you just look on LinkedIn and see how many of our graduates who live in Taiwan went to American schools. I mean, it's remarkable. My chairman, my CEO, my senior leaders, like my general counsel, our leadership in engineering, a lot of them are graduates of the amazing American universities. And it's also true is that our American workforce, many of them are Taiwanese Americans who went to school in Taiwan and now work here. So that relationship is already ongoing, right? And that's just deepening and broadening that, creating more places. I often tell senators when they ask about the subject, Patrick, we're going to give these billions of dollars to, these foundry companies, the IDM companies, what's in it for you? And I have to tell the story that you just heard. But I also don't want to miss, there are things that we probably could do, right? If I wanted to create the perfect incentive, I would say, why don't we just pay for the college of everybody who wants to get a double E? Sorry, but if we're going to put the subsidy somewhere, I'm apologies to Wall Street, but I would rather give, a lot of fellowships to create a lot more engineers in the United States. Again, I'm biased, but I think that would be fabulous. We certainly also have a problem about prioritizing chip design over manufacturing. Our engineering schools in the US, and this is a friendly, loving criticism, right? They tend to be a little focused maybe on a decade ago when manufacturing was more important. And so a lot of the engineers who want to pursue careers in semiconductors, they are more focused on careers in manufacturing. And I'm really excited to see a change in that, but we still fight. A family member of mine, I don't want to out them on the web here, but a family member of mine got an engineering degree from an amazing, one of the top, 10 engineering schools in America. And I was like, this is so awesome. I'm going to do a recommendation. They should totally come work for MediaTek. And, he was like, thanks, Patrick, but I want to go design video games. And talk about crushing, yes, video games are cool, and I'm glad you got your double E, and I'm sure it'll be really fun to make it work, but we'd really love to have you in the semiconductor industry. And that's our challenge, right, is we have to tell our own story as an industry and persuade young people, men and women, people of color, people who've been outside the engineering world. We have to explain how cool it is to build the technology that the whole rest of the global economy rides on, right? There's nothing else cooler than that. It's the foundational technology for our whole global economy. So, come in, the water is fine, I guess. That's my...
Can I just add to
Go
that?
ahead.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think one thing that, the past few years have really underscored is how critically important semiconductors are to all of consumers and society and governments. But with this transition now to 5G technology, we're seeing a major paradigm shift where we are now not only connecting people and places, but things, devices, and machines. And semiconductors are in everything. They're in cars, they're in energy grids, healthcare, smart city, devices. So this demand is only going to further increase. We do need to look at ways to address capacity challenges. We do need to look at ways to even further, develop talent, further maximize efficiencies, further collaboration amongst allies on these. How do we minimize disruption in the future from supply shortages? But one of the things one of the reasons this problem, the supply challenge has been such a problem is because of the exponentially increasing demand for semiconductors. And so that is really been driving a lot of the supply challenges is around that incredible demand.
Yeah. Thank you both. I just add, Jason, on the Taiwan end, I think there are periphery issues that are very important that are also impacting what's happening here. In Taiwan, I think Taiwan's immigration policy is a problem because there's a finite number of workers. It's a politically sensitive issue, but it's having a practical impact on the pool of people that can be drawn upon. And there are many significant and important companies in Taiwan that people should work for, but it's hard to compete against TSMC, but just to put them right at the top there, because of the benefits that they offer. Here in the States, we have a much larger pool of people, and I accept implicitly the passion and eloquence that Patrick applied to university levels, but underneath universities, in the high schools and middle schools, education can be very political, and the maths and the sciences is getting sucked into the culture wars, and that's unfortunate. Because, again, at a practical level, it might deprive, as you move up, really good qualified students from rising up and going into all these schools that Patrick's talking about and excelling in areas that we're discussing today. Other questions? I think I saw several over here. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. My name is Thomas. I'm a statistician / civil engineer, so I'm not usually privy to these types of conversations, but it's been so fascinating, so thank you to all the panelists. My question today is, I'm surprised that climate change was not discussed as a source of risk, given that the manufacturing sector is so uniquely exposed to drought and seismic risk. I'm curious about your opinions on the types of headwinds that may place on your individual companies, as well as the Taiwan economy more broadly.
Do either of you have other company positions on climate change that relate to?
Well, certainly for sustainability. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the semiconductor industry, right, is that we're manipulating, not literally us, because we're not a manufacturing company, but in design and in manufacturing, we're literally manipulating atoms, right? The level of design, and so the control of gases and our use of energy and the careful way that is required, right, to manufacture semiconductors means that focus on resource conservation, right, maximizing, I mean, just the crushing competition alone means that you have to be really, really focused on conservation and efficient use of materials and equipment, et cetera. Now, the vulnerability is a different question, right? Whether it's seismic or whether, obviously, we've seen some, many instances of that, right? And I think the point is, right, more capacity gives you more flexibility, right? And I think as the cost of these semiconductor fabs continues to go up, right? We're looking in 5 years, it's going to be $20 billion, right, to build a state-of-the-art fab, or more, right? And I think what the challenge of that is, you do get more vulnerable, right, whenever you get more capital concentrated in a really small area. And that's the geography problem, right? Where before in the US we had maybe 75, 80 fabs in all different states. I used to keep a map in my office when I was running the SIA office here of all the states where we have fabs, and many of those are gone now, right? They got consolidated other places. They were 30 years old and they got closed. But that geographic diversity, those little small fabs, many of them were 8-inch or smaller fabs, that allowed you to spread risk around, right? But because of the economies of scale, we have to make fabs much bigger, and that just means concentrating more risk in a smaller number of geographies. I'm glad I don't have to have that job to choose where to put them, because it's hard, right? Because the place where the talent is, maybe that doesn't have enough water, and if it has a lot of water, maybe it's unstable. And I'll stick to my day job. That's hard.
Julie, any thoughts on this from Qualcomm's standpoint?
No, it's a great question. We announced earlier this year, a series of commitments, in this area, and they, as we don't do a lot of manufacturing ourselves, they apply to our upstream and downstream suppliers and partners as well. I wish I could remember at the moment what the commitments are, but they're very public, and we announced them a few months ago. So it's been a lot of focus and attention on those exact commitments.
A lot of the environmental challenges for our industry are about the cycle of replacement and obsolescence, right? Because consumer electronics is all a battle of wanting to have a new device in 2 years or 5 years or whatever, right? We're heavily invested in the consumer electronics space, and so that's a challenge. And so, as a design principle, I know Qualcomm has been a leader in this area, and MediaTek certainly is in Taiwan. We have been focusing on how do you have longer life cycles, right? So maybe you can pay for an upgrade, plug and play to extend the life of electronics so you're not adding so much to landfill. And I think the good news is that a focus on that, because of resource scarcity, is going to increase. People are going to want to figure out, like, how can we make these technologies last longer, to make the investment we did in mined products, for instance, specialty metals and other things. How do we make the life cycles of products to serve our environmental goals?
One of the things I think that can be hard to see in public reporting or access to public information about pressures on Taiwan from the States or from the supply chain is the commitments that the largest companies are placing on the systems integrators. And in fact, below tier 1 systems integrators, tier 2, even deeper down the supply chain than that, to, for example, at some point in time, let's say 2030 or some date in the near future, to source all their energy from renewables. Well, that creates a huge demand within Taiwan for renewable energy. Now, that has a public policy and practical impact as it tries to roll out. The government wants to set ambitious targets, in fact, has done. But to get to that point and to meet the demand and requirements of the biggest global companies on their Taiwan partners is very significant. When I say there's tension in there, I don't mean disagreement. I'm not saying we think this and you think that on the issue of climate change. Only tension in respect to how to meet the ambition that is embedded there. And if you look at Taiwan, to use the word cavalier, I don't wish to be cavalier, but while I think we all accept that the threat from the PLA is very significant, I think at a more practical level for companies, the greater challenge isn't the People's Liberation Army, it's access to energy, water, land, and human capital in Taiwan. That, from a commercial economic standpoint, is the more pressing issue in the moment when thinking about where to deploy capital and whether Taiwan remains a viable, ongoing place to do that. Does that make sense? Yeah. I think there's a young lady just behind you. Yeah, please.
Thank you all so much for speaking in this panel. It's incredible. My name is Zoe. I'm with the Global Taiwan Institute here in DC. So I heard a lot about China's own dependence on Taiwan's semiconductor industry. But a conversation that's being had a lot right now in the geoeconomic space is China's pursuit of dual circulation, right? Its pursuit of autonomy domestically while also fostering dependence on its own, industries through other countries. So I'd like to know, at a corporate level, is this something you're considering when it comes to your relationships with China? Is its dual circulation strategy actually a threat when it comes to its dependence on Taiwan's semiconductors, and how you go about that at a corporate level?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think Qualcomm is the largest fabless semiconductor company in the world, and we have partners and customers all over the globe, including in Taiwan and China, and so for us, it's critical to be able to continue doing business, with our customers and our partners in both of these countries. So that's really one of our priorities.
I would only say, I guess, about the core of your question, right? Is the China market incredibly important to us? Yes, it is, absolutely. And the supply of semiconductors is incredibly important to China. If you would permit a friendly observation, right, about this debate, it really is about attracting capital. And I think the Chinese have found out, right, that there's a price to pay from looking like a less good bet. And I think this is, again, hearkening back to the conversation this morning, right, about there is a premium in the marketplace for being a more stable, reliable, welcoming government. And if you're a functioning government, right, you're going to attract more investment. And I think that tension for China, their desire to be independent of global supply chain or be more self-reliant, that's important. But as a part of that, you really have to attract capital. You have to be a good bet. And I think those two goals, and by the way, China's goal is no different than anyone else. You talk to, as I do, parliamentarians in the European Union or in Japan or here in Washington, they all want chip independence because they suddenly, and I mean it suddenly, I worked for the industry for a long time, and this is a very new phenomenon where members suddenly have passionate views about why we should be making more chips in Japan or in the United States, or depending on who you're talking to. So in that respect, China is just like everyone else, right? They want greater autonomy. The difference is, of course, is that they dominate the assembly of consumer electronics, right? Like 75-80% of all electronics in the world are assembled in China. And so again, I sympathize. They are like, why are we just doing assembly? We want to do the highest order part of this market. I just think that the deal is, China every day looks like a less good bet for global companies to make an investment, right? Because the regulatory environment seems unstable. I think the challenges of dealing with COVID has uncovered some risks, geopolitical risks, notwithstanding the Strait relations issues. And I think, those things will play themselves out because I think governments, all of them, are very responsive, right, to this desire to get investment. I think the real hope is, right, that will encourage better government everywhere. The idea that there's a global competition to be an attractive place to invest. For us as a fabless company, right, it also is about, again, the talent, because it's where brilliant engineers and scientists, where do they want to live, right? And that quality of life, just like Arizona has to sell themselves, or California or Texas or whomever has to sell themselves as a great place to live, every political jurisdiction has to play that game of saying, this is a great place to be an entrepreneur. This is a great place to bring your technology to market, right? You have to tell that story, and the tension, right, over wanting to get the regulatory state the way the political people want it to be, but also play the sales game of saying, do your innovation here. That tension is lived out every day, right, in political capitals all across the world, and so China is no different in that respect.
Zoe, it's such a super question. Thank you for it. I'd make the observation that the membership of the US-China Business Council and the membership of the US-Taiwan Business Council, you can almost match them up, except defense companies, of course, because there's no business for them in China rightly. But my point simply being is that our companies want to be able to do business in both. Now, we live in the real world here. There are practical policy implications involved, particularly in heightened tensions with the Chinese, and I would certainly argue those tensions are not going to dissipate anytime soon. We just simply have too many challenges. But I loved Shirley's point in the first panel about Taiwan being a buy option. I absolutely agree. Not just because I've been doing this all my life, but because for one, I think there's one word that captures why Taiwan will continue to be such a critical partner for global companies, whether Taiwan out or global companies in, and that's trust, is that they're trusted. They're trusted to take IP and to consider it and to protect it. They're trusted to manufacture it at the highest levels, to deliver it to their customers when they say they're going to deliver, and that when it's delivered and integrated, that it will work. And that's not something that you can just stand up and walk with. That takes decades to build. So trust is a really, really key word, I think, here when we talk about Taiwan's ongoing viability as a critical player in the global economy. I think it was, not yes, sir, right here, yeah.
Thank you, guys. John Sine from the US-China Economic Security Review Commission. I was wondering if we could maybe get into a little bit more of the specifics about China's development of its fabless ecosystem. It seems to me, as you mentioned, they are trying to move up, people call the smile curve, add more value. SMIC has run into problems, but it seems like fabless design is maybe actually something where they do have a bit of, they are moving somewhere in the right direction. Are you guys seeing that? What is the competitive, do you guys view that as a competitive challenge? Would love to just hear any insights you guys have.
That sounds like a good question for Julie.
Well, there's definitely been a lot of capital that has been pledged to that effort. And so, when you have deep pockets, it is possible to get there at some point. I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. Particularly in the leading edge technology, leading edge nodes, but certainly they will be able to make headroads in other sectors of the global supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of advantages to having really strong state support. I mean, that's not controversial, right? Like every country in the world that has really good state support for a really capital intensive, very high-end industry like the semiconductor industry is going to do well. And I think China has developed a lot of really great success. We look at our competitors in China. We have a play, not as big as Qualcomm's, but we have a big play in China, and we have to be better. The good news, again, this to circle back, not to sound like a broken record, right? But the good news is if you're a brilliant engineer and you can live anywhere, right? You want to live in a free and open, dynamic economy where you have a great quality of life, right? And I think that's what it's about, right? It's that talent race to give the brilliant men and women who design technologies, to give them the environment that they need to succeed, right? A place where they can be with their family, they can achieve, a lot of success. And I think Taiwan has proved to be very successful at that because their engineers do very, very well. I think the U.S. is still the most attractive place in the world to found and to build a company, right? This is just you get a great market, it's a great quality of life, you got great support for academics. I mean, there are a lot of wins, right? But other companies other countries are coming on all the time on that same competition, right? As how do we provide this awesome place to innovate and create things? And we're going to be there. That's our commitment, from our company. Is wherever the brilliant people want to work, that's where we're going to go, right? Because that's what we have to do. And it's funny, I tell members of Congress, here in the US, if we don't get our immigration policy right, don't worry, the market will fix this for you, Congressman. I know immigration's hard, like, you're right, it is hard, but don't worry, the market will fix this. You just won't like the answer, right? Because we're going to hire graduates of American universities, some of them Taiwanese, but they want to live in Europe. And so we'll get a visa for them to live where they want to live because they get to call the shots. We are living in an era, right, where it's Moneyball for these brilliant engineers, and you want these players to play for you. And you're going to do whatever it takes to attract them to come work for your team. And that's just the reality of if you want to be a global leader, you have to act like one, and you have to, compete for this talent. And I think that is China's challenge, frankly, in trying to compete, is that you have to present all the picture, right? Not just great investments in university research that the Chinese have made big commitments, or even free capital or overhead or support. It's not enough. You got to be a great place to live, and engineers can command that. So,
we've got time for a couple more questions. This lady right here, please. Thank you.
Thank you for this incredible discussion. My name is Janelle, and I'm with Promotion Association for Public Affairs. So my question today is that, this might be broad actually, that you see the increasing nationalism or countries seeking for cheap independence. So as a company that you run globally, how you adapt to this mindset, as well as that, how would you like the government to play, especially with touch upon immigration policy and education policy? So how would you like government to assist the private sectors like you guys to adapt to this change and to, at the same time, to retain the advantages that you've built so far?
Did you get the question?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, what the things that we want, the companies we want, Qualcomm and MediaTek, we're both members of SIA, right, a Semiconductor Industry Association. We're respective members of our trade associations, and the one thing that we always advocate for, right, is the ability to hire great people, right? Whatever the flexibility. So produce them, please, whatever Congress we happen to be sitting in, please support university research, right? Do the basic research that's going to design the technologies, the materials, the problems, right, of the future. Invest in that, because we also get those brilliant men and women, right, who are solving those problems, and they're going to come work for us. So that's important. And then what you are speaking about is also mobility, right? We want the ability to move talent to where the problems are, right? And we have to go sit next to our customers. So if that's Verizon one day and Amazon the next, right? We want our talent to be able to go where the customer is, and that requires a great deal of flexibility. And so the political, I think nativism is a word that came up, right, or whatever. That's just competition. People feel the urgency of semiconductors, and they want to, like politicians of all sides in every country, they want to respond to that pressure. But I think the answer is, right, you can't grasp too strongly about it, because it's important. You actually have to create that mobility, right? That it's a kind of a counterintuitive thing for politics to realize that you need to make talent movement easier, so then you'll win, and that countries that do a better job of attracting talent will do better.
Julie, do you want to add anything?
I just want to add, I think Patrick, hit that the nail on the head on that one, for sure. There are, we have seen a change in trend in recent years in more nationalistic policies. That's understandable. Every country wants their national treasures and national champions, but I think it's going to be, there will be some adjustments, but there's always going to remain a very critical global interdependence within this industry. That's unavoidable. You still have raw materials that can only come from certain countries and certain places, and certain countries have developed their niche, and it really comes down to where the talent lies. That's all.
I think I might just add quickly. I'll get right to you, sir. On industrial policy in this area, as has been mentioned, not every country that wants this is going to get it. The capital costs in of themselves are just too prohibitive. But I'm not asking Patrick and Julie to comment on this, because they deal with companies up and down the manufacturing line on this. But I would suggest to all of you that what we're heading to in all likelihood is a sort of two-tier manufacturing system, where there's TSMC and Samsung at the forefront, and then there's a mid-tier. I'm sorry to Intel, but I think that TSMC and Samsung are going to be very hard to catch, and that they will continue to dominate high-end. And that will almost certainly suggest continued concentration of high-end manufacturing in a very small number of areas of the world. Korea and Taiwan, of course, and in the southwestern part of the United States, it looks like. Beyond then, it's, maybe somewhere in Europe, but I don't think we're going to see much more than that at the high end. At the more commoditized end, yes, perhaps a spread of more manufacturing around the world. Yes, the gentleman in the baseball cap.
Hello, I want to thank the panel for a very good, very interesting contribution. My name is Elliot Hurwitz. I'm a retired person. Julie mentioned 5G technology. And of course, we all know about Huawei and its activities in the PRC. Anybody would like to answer the question on what is the current status and the prospects of 5G technology in the United States?
Well, I mean, you're talking to the two most important 5G companies in the world.
That's a great question.
Yes, 5G, incredibly important. And, there's, at the top, I would say there's a big disconnect between what American consumers think about 5G, because they look at their phone, and that's like my number one conversation at Thanksgiving or whatever is like, oh, Patrick, we already have 5G. It says that right on my phone. And I'm like, actually, no, that's not what we're talking about. It's an exponential change, right? I think that we're going to live through a period over the next decade, right? A huge global experiment, right, about the adoption of a new cutting-edge technology, 5G, and what it will transform in more connectivity, the richness of life, and how data and information can either enrich or, other implications. But the real challenge is building that infrastructure. And I think that's the thing that I think, certainly in America, we don't understand enough, is that to build a parallel system, right? You can imagine the challenge we had from 1925 to 1945, building rural electrification, right? Running power lines all across America to every single household. That was a huge transformational infrastructure decision that the United States made to electrify every household in America. We are literally saying we're going to have to do that again, right? Not with our existing cellular networks, right? It's a parallel system. It's not the same. And we haven't done that in a very, very long time. And so that's a big political and societal change, right, to build this whole new infrastructure. So some people, and this is get back to the experiment thing, this is just Patrick Wilson's view, it's not MediaTek's view, I should say, as a caveat. But the deal is, right, we're going to do an experiment about whether a huge government capital investment in some countries where it's all going to come from the government and they're going to try to erect this network, or whether using a private-centered, customer-focused solution, right, having a network that's built out when customers demand it, which model is better, right? And so we, as chip makers, we have to navigate every country in the world having a different choice. And some of them will be hybrids, right, of lots of private sector lead, but then the support from the government and vice versa on some dial. And we have to figure out how to navigate that. So that's a really big challenge for every company in the whole space. So it's going to be a really fascinating time. I mean, the good news is it's a great time for consumers, because the things that your technology can do and the way we make things. I come from the industrial segment myself, having worked for BMW and Cummins. It's just going to revolutionize the way we measure everything, because you can measure everything, therefore you will, and that's what 5G in that setting is going to do, and it's very exciting. But anyway.
Yeah. So. The digital transformation is happening, and it's happening now. And 5G technology is what is going to help not just the U.S. Economy and society, but countries all over the world get to that digital transformation. We've got automobiles are now smartphones on wheels. Laptops now have 5G cellular connectivity, so that students can access learning anytime, anywhere, inside, outside the classroom, accelerated by the remote learning requirements over the past few years, unfortunately. Transformation of the laptop as well. It's become more of a communications device than ever before. Camera is important. 5G is alive and well in the U.S. and many other countries are catching up. But part of this transformation also has to do with the connectivity to everything being on the cloud, and that has a very significant change on the design of the devices and how you no longer need memory on these devices. So it's everything. Everyone and everything needs to be able to seamlessly connect to the cloud. So 5G is going to be very, very important for the U.S.
Where data is a big, that's the big change, right? Is data you use every 10 minutes, right? That's going to be stored on your device. Data you use every 10 years, that's silly to put that right on your local device. And so that triaging of data where it needs to be in the cloud or on your device or connected, that's just going to get better and better. That's one of the real challenges for using machine learning and artificial intelligence, is to learn about you, the user, to make the data you use all the time rational, right? So that it's just working really, really well. And that is a huge chip design challenge for us, to use that incredible compute power that we're developing to solve that problem for everybody, for each individual user. So you're not picking up the blue pill or the red pill, right? Based on what kind of user you are, your software is going to learn your habits and be like, oh, actually, this is a power user for photos, so we're going to store your photos right on your phone so you can get them all the time. But if you never look at photos that are older than 30 days, your software will know that, like, oh, Patrick never looks at photos older than 30 days, so I don't have to store those locally. And we already do that, but you're going to see more. You're going to see more applications like that all across consumer electronics.
I know there are more questions. We've already run over, and I recognize that you all have other things to do in your day. I want to thank our speakers, Julie and Patrick, very much for your time this morning. Just fascinating. And I also wish to thank Brookings and Ryan. I'm sure all of you are well acquainted with his publications, with the efforts of his colleagues on Taiwan-related matters. I cannot recommend them more highly to you. Brookings is a leader in thinking about America's relationship with Taiwan, what that should look like in the future. And the US-Taiwan Business Council obviously will continue to serve the interests of its membership and also to act as a resource for our country on commercial matters with Taiwan. Thank you all so very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Cheers.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.